there is something that is keeping us from understanding each other. And you made a post about why nothing makes sense right now. And I just want to read it out in totality because I thought it was a great post. There is an interesting slow-burning realization, both economically and socially, that we are, as if, living with the after effects of having lost a war without even realizing we were in one. With no bombs even dropped, our industrial capacity has been eviscerated, our autonomy has been compromised, we've lost our youth, not to the battlefield deaths, but to low fertility. The population has post-traumatic shock in the form of a mental health crisis or an addiction crisis. Those working work harder than ever before due to collapsing boundaries between work, life, and leisure. Cultural traditions and key institutions are being phased out. Privacy is being lost. Whether you tolerate the rich or not, their wealth is under attack too, but not necessarily for domestic redistribution. By many estimates, foreign investors now own more than 50% of the UK stock market and roughly a quarter to a third of UK government debt, meaning an ever larger amount of our surplus or profit makes its way abroad, where it cannot be taxed. To quote K-pop Demon Hunters, which you do quite often, the song we couldn't write, this is what it sounds like. What prompted you to write that?
When I write stories, I sometimes am hit by these epiphanies. I'm like, oh man, it's just like, oh wow. And that was one of those epiphanies. I was like, wow. One day I was like analyzing, I don't know, some sort of economic data. And I just realized like if I was, because I am trained like academically as a historian. So I think that's what makes my writing a bit different. And I'm quite polymathic. I look at all sorts of different areas. And I kind of was looking at this data and I was thinking, wow, if I was like an economist in 1950 looking at this data, I'd be like, well, this is equivalent to a country coming out of a massive war. And that was really my, and I had just been like going through some old photos and I'd found some images of my grandparents' factories in Warsaw before and after and how they'd been completely destroyed. And then I was remembering about how, the baby boom followed, because everyone was talking about like, that we're we cannot sort of turn around the demographic situation. And I was thinking, well, they did it after the war. Why wouldn't it make sense to, it can be, I think, overcome again. It's just that, and then that's what made me realize. I was like, well, if we see the last 20, 30 years as more of a kind of a war that we didn't even know we were having, then I think the realization of that is much more likely to make us more open to fixing the issues that made us lose out in all these ways. And a lot of it is about lost growth. A lot of it is about, I think, underappreciating how we were, I don't want to put, this is very controversial because I know that a lot of people don't necessarily see it as a sort of communist versus capitalist fight or a sort of clash of economic systems. Mm-hmm. I tend to see it that way. I'm open to people who don't. But for me, I think this is definitely a product of sort of some of the worst tendencies of the communist type mentality infiltrating the capitalist system to the point that the usual corrective measures that capitalism allows for have been kind of sidetracked or, shoved to one side, which has had this unfortunate sort of reaction or consequence rather, that has eroded so much of our capital base without us even
Can you elaborate on that?
The capital base issue is complex because if you're an American, you might say, well, we still have a lot of capital. And so you have to differentiate between sort of bricks and mortar, sort of atom-based capital, which is like factories, plants, like the, physical infrastructure. Yeah. Yep. And digital or financial capital, right? And so it's not necessarily accurate to say that all your capital has been eroded. It's more that it has been the stuff that allows for strategic autonomy has been eroded. Because you can have all the financial capital and all the digital capital in the world, but if you haven't got access to energy, if you haven't got access to, manufacturing or rare earths, or what we're figuring all this out now, especially because of the Iran crisis, then it doesn't really matter if you have all that other stuff, because you can't. You're on, in terms, it's like an onion, and those sort of financial and digital layers are only possible because of the fundamental inner layer, which depends on like hardcore manufacturing and physical infrastructure. So that's what I mean, is that in a way, I think I do think this was down to a sort of conscious decision by countries like China to effectively outcompete on that front, to the point that America basically and the West becomes entirely dependent on China, and then has to kind of admit that their way is better, and that undermines the usual kind of understanding that capitalism in the free market sense is better than the Chinese way. But I think the other part of this story, and I think we're now learning that in Europe, like as we hear suddenly all about, in Europe you hear it constantly now. There's a need for strategic autonomy, right? And you hear it especially from the French, the Germans maybe less so, but like still. But in Brussels, it's the current sort of mantra. It's like, we must establish strategic autonomy. And I thought it was quite interesting because yesterday I saw the FT actually had done a fun kind of infographic about like what your day would be like if you didn't have access to American digital services. And it showed like how dependent we all are, and like whether it's from Gmail, Spotify, God knows, like the whole day is full of American infrastructure, and also payments, of course, Visa and MasterCard, notably. And I was like, well, so that's quite interesting. So like America has this strategic autonomy gap vis-a-vis, the hard power that
manufacturing resources.
Yes.
Yep.
But Europe has kind of not enough of both, and it has a dependency on American infrastructure on the digital and financial side. So there are these different sort of relationships between the whole system, and I think Europe in particular has had the sharp end of this, because with Germany now completely, its manufacturing base is being hollowed out by high energy prices, the removal of nuclear from the German grid, but sanctions against Russia, and beyond that, pressure.
The Nord Stream pipeline, and also pressure from Chinese competitors, right? So suddenly you have this bizarre situation where what was once your manufacturing leader in Europe is on the back foot, and but on top of that, they don't have any national champions in terms of tech either. So Europe is really, I think, the one that is most disadvantaged on all fronts, because at least China has manufacturing and America has digital services. So that entire thread, I think, applies mostly to Europe, more so than America in that case, if you think about it that way, because really, it fits the historical pattern. The real fight is always over Europe for some weird reason. It feels like Germany has this constant need to be apologetic about any kind of ambition, and it doesn't make any sense to me.
Well, I've been looking at, like, sometimes we become complacent about the lessons of history. And when sitting here in 2026, it's easy to forget, like, what happened in the 50s or the 60s, and the sort of mood and mentality of the elites or the people generally in a post-war environment where there was obviously a bit of resentment towards Germany.
Sure.
And we didn't do reparations in the conventional way, because that was what led from World War I to World War II. Instead, there was this actually very, in retrospect, when you think about it, it was a very warm and cuddly approach of Marshall Plan and helping redevelopment and allowing Germany to come out on top in terms of industrial capacity and manufacturing and for years and years, Germany ends up being like the strong man of Europe in that sense.
Well, it was West Germany for the longest time that was able to rekindle its manufacturing base and become a dominant power.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so, but one never questions why. Like, why did that happen? And this is where I've been kind of going back into the archives, trying to understand the mentality. And I realize now that actually all of this was made possible because of the industrial policy that was considered a norm in Europe at that time, right? And France as well was doing industrial policy. And so it wasn't a market-led recovery. So the Americans had come in, saved everyone's asses, as they'd like to say. And they saw the next fight as that between, free market capitalism versus the rise of communism. And the battleground for that was Europe, like Central Europe and Western Europe. And Germany, I think, this is the funny thing, is that despite having won the war and being able to kind of control everything and having nukes, they allow Germany to basically become this, to focus on industrial policy in ways that completely clashes with the mentality or the ideology of the American system.
Can I make a suggestion? I'm open to your correction because I'm not a historian, but my reading of it at a very sort of high level was that Europe was quite happy for Germany to be split in two, given the sort of threat that it had posed throughout the early part of the 20th century, World War I, World War II. And then in addition to that, after World War II, they wanted to rebuild West Germany as a sort of bulwark against East Germany to see which version would be the best. And then sort of the whole idea of Germany as a menace became, we need our example of Germany to be the superior one to the Soviet Germany. And so perhaps that may have been the reason why the Marshall Plan gained so much support in order to build them back up.
Oh, you're right. I mean, that whole like divide and conquer and, but because Germany was an occupied country afterward, after the war. And certainly there was this sort of, as you say, it was like, a Pepsi test or whatever, like which system is going to come out on top. Or like nowadays, sometimes you see the kind of the pictures of Korea, with the nighttime illumination.
Oh, the lights across North and South Korea, and clearly it's just darkness across North Korea. And
it's similar. Yeah. It's a similar sort of testing ground, right, for the two models. So yes, absolutely. But that's why it's so interesting to me that Germany actually gets away with so much industrial policy, but with the blessing of America in a roundabout way. And so what's really taking place, I mean, this is not official. This is just my deconstruction of how things are. I mean, this is from my weird perspective. It's almost as if instead of reparations, the deal is like you don't have an army because we can't let you have army. You definitely don't get nukes. We wouldn't trust you with nukes. But you do financial repression because your people kind of need to fund everybody else for a bit. And for 80 years, you can like generate a surplus and focus on industry. We'll buy your products. You become like the workhouse for like Japan, same situation, by the way. You become like the workhouse for the West. And it's all funded through de facto financial repression of the Germans who end up like incredibly, I don't think people realize how financially repressed. I mean, you can tell just in terms of like the average interest that you get at the high street bank in Germany, even today, it's a fraction, like, even when rates are relatively similar in the UK versus Germany and France, like the European depositors get a fraction of what we get because there is a sort of a kind of inbuilt repression. So people can't save in the same way. Germans are incredibly wealthy in some ways, but it comes because of this sort of de facto repression. Remember, like Germany, most people don't own their own homes. They're all rentiers, and they're all renting, a lot of them. So
Who owns the property?
a small cadre of industrial families.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I would imagine,
Yeah.
but it's this sort of middle stand. There is a small elite of very wealthy Germans, and the vast majority of the population is quite precarious. It's a really weird, but it's also very cohesive. So it's an interesting result that emerges post-war. And for me, you always hear about Germany's surpluses and how, the infamous debt break that they had, and the fact that they're very frugal and that they're the ones that don't overspend, and they reinvest. And if you look at like the top holders of U.S. treasuries, they're up there with Japan, and it's all to do in my mind. It's almost like, this is going to sound weird, but it's like they're a secret war chest for the Americans. It's like we couldn't do industrial policy domestically, so we outsourced it to Germany and Japan, right? And they were able to do it because their political systems allowed for it, and it was the norm in those areas. And so we could then compete with the Russians or the communists, because we would never have been able to compete otherwise, because they would have undercut everybody. So you use your allies, aka your occupied territories, as a sort of place where you can run industrial policy, and then ask them to reinvest the proceeds in your national debt. This makes a lot of sense, because what does that mean in practice? They're under your security umbrella. They're basically funding the government, so they're funding your military. So that's the deal, and so that's why it doesn't really matter when everyone looks at America's exposure to Japan and just its general kind of over indebtedness. The indebtedness to Germany and in Japan doesn't theoretically matter, because they're allies, right? They're under our security umbrella, and as a consequence, if they, like what you see Trump doing is like Trump goes, right, well, we now need you to repatriate those profits, because we're drawing down on that secret war chest. You've been operating offshore, all this industrial capacity. We want to now reshore it back to the US, because we're now gonna bootstrap the war machine.
Yeah.
And it's all there, and it's been hidden in plain sight, this big war chest. Not the same with China, though. And the main difference is that China is not under the US security umbrella.
We started off by speaking about this growing malaise over society, and we can, it equally applies to the UK as it does Europe and the United States. What do you think the key distinction is that allowed the political infrastructure and decision makers to recognize the problem post-World War II and do something about it, versus now, where I think, in quiet conversations, the realization is there, but there's no political will to actually do anything about it with policy?
So I think the post-war era was very different. It was an era when the Americans were, really focused on developing the rest of the world. I mean, there are some great documentaries about the sort of very, I would say, noble infrastructure development that the Americans organized, and the know-how that they shared with all sorts of developing countries. Afghanistan is one example. Iran is another example, where so much of the infrastructure and parts of South America, obviously too, all developed by US industrial kind of powerhouses and corporates. And it was done in a sort of almost like a Rooseveltian spirit, right? And I think, or at least there was this sense of giving back, right? And that, I think, changes. I think the fundamental point is that gets overstretched. And by the 60s, 70s, you see like the Bretton Woods system, which de facto kind of funds a lot of that extraterritorial development, being pushed to its limits. And the question is, why does it start to collapse? Because the real kind of the moment everything changes is 1971 after Bretton Woods collapses, and you end up with like radical market liberalization, right? Which is great in some ways, but it's also when everything gets a bit more precarious and where some of those institutional norms become challenged, right? And by the 80s and Reagan and Thatcher, you have this idea that, neoliberalism, countries just need deregulation and actually just allowing markets to do their thing is enough. And I think that's where the trouble starts. And that's not to say I'm actually quite sympathetic to Reagan and Thatcher, but I think that it was an oversight. I don't think they did it intentionally necessarily, but I think they didn't understand the degree to which openness, open markets, they're all great, but only if we're all operating on the same standard. But when you have open markets and capitalism competing with still quite powerful industrial policy countries, then by nature, the open societies start to absorb the policies of the industrial policy countries.
You think it was inadvertent?
I mean, who knows?
I do. I know. It just
you think it was? Yeah, you don't think it was?
Absolutely no. And it was industrialists absolutely knew that they were going to undercut their local working population's wages and increase their margins by offshoring manufacturing. They absolutely knew that.
Yeah, that they did.
So they knew that was going to happen. And that's exactly what happened. And they kept doing that for about 35 years. And it really only became a national issue in the United States, for example, when Trump popped up and said, let's make America great again. Now, whether or not people believe in that rhetoric, he did bring up within the discussion the idea that actually we've hollowed out our entire industrial base and now we're vulnerable. And for the first time in 40, 45 years, that was an admission that was made publicly by a leading political figure. And so everyone knew, everyone running a company knew that. Every dropshipper idiot dropshipper online knew what the arbitrage opportunity was. I'm absolutely certain, CFOs of various leading companies knew the benefits. The chief operating officer knew, the CEO knew, the board knew. It was the thing to be done. And especially I used to read things like The Economist and the business magazines back home, Australian Financial Review and all the rest of that, right? They knew. Right. And this was when I was coming of age, by the way. Right. So at a time when I knew nothing, miseducated with a business degree, and I'm reading all these magazines and newspapers and columnists thinking I'm learning something. Yeah, I am. I'm learning about them, actually, what their points of views are. And they knew what the dividend was. And I just want to take it back to a scenario because I want you to push back against this if you disagree, because the key thing was governments hated the labour unions because all governments, left and right, even Labour in Australia, Labour was a manifestation of the union movement, the same as it is in this country. But they felt like the people in the political wing felt like we were the ones who were elected. Why do we have to listen to you shits, the union leaders? And so I think they were quietly happy that they were sort of undermined in that sense, and they didn't have to answer to labour unions. Union membership declined over a period of two decades, and it started really with the fall of the Berlin Wall, dissolution of the Soviet Union, and as a result, Western governments no longer needed to hedge their policies to be like socialist enough not to encourage more socialism in a capitalist environment. So in my mind, they absolutely knew what they were doing because it happened in every single country. And the benefits, the dividend to the companies who were actively offshoring was so obvious. And what was the first thing they thought about was it's cheaper. That's the first thing they said. They didn't say it was more skilled or whatever. If they were more skilled, they'd offshore to Germany or Japan, who were the highest skilled manufacturers of that era. They didn't do that. They went to China, India, Vietnam, maybe Latin America, certainly Turkey, different parts like that, and why they do that. It was those countries had to be upskilled enough to exploit the local population and their lower cost base. So from my point of view, they absolutely knew what was happening. So this bifurcation that we are now seeing, where the managerial class and capital owners, where they're doing particularly well, and everybody else. So for the longest time, it was first of all just the so-called lower skilled workers and the lower wage earners who were being crushed. But that slowly crept up through the lower middle class, middle management, and upper middle management now is bearing the brunt of that. And so now it becomes a societal problem, because if you're poor, that's your problem. We made poverty a moral failing of the poor, right? In our public discourse, that's what we made it. And you're just not trying hard enough. Because look, GDP is growing. Why aren't you fighting for your share? But now that it's society-wide, we have to recognize that it's been a deliberate policy of hollowing out our entire societies, both economically, industrially, and now we're seeing the political manifestations of that.
So I think you're right. I don't dispute any of that. What I would say is that there's another element to it that I think slightly sort of, at least I think, redeems some of these decision makers, which is that I genuinely now think that they were under the impression that if we invested enough in China and we brought our working practices to those countries, as we did in the post-war development phase, then over time, China, India would become more like us, right? And that they would liberalize, and that we wouldn't have these distorting effects because market forces would kind of moderate the extremes, and
moderate the political extremes of those countries,
but also the economic consequences of, and allow for more ebb and flow. And this is where I'm very sympathetic with the Michael Pettis perspective. And he's this great economist who's based in China, who's written a book with my old colleague, Matt Klein. He's just fantastic on this. This is where he makes the point that, again, the error was assuming that the closed economy is going to absorb the open economy norms rather than vice versa. And actually what ends up happening is, you're right, the open economies, the market systems, they were going to those countries to exploit cheap labor. But the concept was that by doing that, people would go up the skills ladder, they'd get richer, those countries would allow for more consumption, and then the flows would reverse. That never happened because people underestimated the control obsession of the Chinese Communist Party and the fact that they consciously withheld that demand from America through a conscious policy of continuously reinvesting in the debt of in the government debt of the US, which had these effects on the FX rate, which enabled the continuing repression of the Chinese, to the point that today there's this, we're here speaking on the eve of like the discussions between Trump and Xi. And I was looking yesterday, there's these rumors that they might come to some agreement where China reinvests $1 trillion into the US. And that really isn't an investment, it's just a substitution. It's like, okay, we were investing in debt, now we're going to invest that money has to go somewhere. It either gets consumed through imports, which is great for America because then there's demand for products from America, or it gets invested in government debt. That's, for a while, that was a very appealing, situation because that funds the government and welfare. But then the alternative is also private sector investment. Now, they tried private sector investment. There was a great documentary that I wrote about in about 10 years ago, maybe less, 6-7 years ago. It was called American Factory. It was all about the Chinese coming and buying Detroit sort of car factories and trying to run them in a way that was cost effective. And it was funded by Obama, this documentary. But it was the documentary makers was this like Veritas school of documentary making. So they were very neutral, unbiased. I really loved it. I think
What's it called?
American Factory.
Okay.
And the amazing thing that you discover is that the Chinese sort of managers are completely bewildered by why American workers just don't work, because they want labor unions. They won't, they want breaks all the time. The Chinese are like, we can't run things up. Like we can't run a profitable operation in America. It's just never going to happen. Not with humans, right? And so this is why China can't reinvest, because it cannot maintain the profitability of its enterprises on work standards that are actually, not slave labor, right? And so that was the arbitrage. The arbitrage was slave labor versus our labor norms. And this is the friction, is like China is stuck because what does it do with those surpluses? So then it goes with BRI, the Belt and Road, because it can still produce things there relatively cost effectively, because you can still maintain that kind of, so it can allow its society to go up the skills ladder or up the value chain, but it basically exports the same model it was doing domestically over there. And that runs a little bit, but there's there's so much more intermediation, so it's losing a lot of the margin through that model. So we're at this point now where China's model is kind of floundering, and on all fronts, you've got AI and robotics. So suddenly, I think it makes sense. China can finally reinvest in America, because you don't have to be dependent on lazy American workers, because you can effectively do highly automated systems and then produce at a somewhat cost-effective, rate in America, and get all the advantages of having your manufacturing at the source of energy and at the demand point, because then you don't have to ship stuff over. So there's actually an efficiency at that point as well. So suddenly it becomes a bit more attractive. And the question is, how can you allow for China to do this without so it's about creating some sort of Commonwealth agreement where America can now tax at least an element of those proceeds, right? Whereas when everything's produced in America, America can't tax it. In fact, on the contrary, it has to pay a coupon to China if it's continuously reinvesting in its debt, right? So that suddenly becomes very cost effective for America. So I saw a lot of feedback yesterday online going, "Oh, this is a terrible idea because the Chinese will come and take over." But perhaps in a weird roundabout way, if we couldn't influence the Chinese and China with our open market ways, having them come and open factories onshore where we can control the norms is quite a good idea. And you should watch this documentary just because the union, the fact immediately the workers want to start a union, and the Chinese hire all these specialists to try and bust the union process, and it turns out the Chinese are way more capitalistic than any of the Americans.
They're extremely capitalistic.
It's incredible.
I think we have underestimated China a great deal for their entrepreneurialism and their creativity and innovation. And I think we're starting to see that realization dawn on, I guess, Western investors and companies as well. You said something, and I just want to ask you to elaborate. You said China's model is floundering.
Yes.
I just want to get more context on that.
So again, it's so hard to make sense of what's going on in the world these days, because everyone has an agenda online, and you can literally put one set of spectacles on where China is just number one, outperforming everybody. It's going to be the new hegemon, and we're all going to bow to China. And then you put another set of spectacles on, and you realize, oh my God, their economy is incredibly precarious and about to collapse. And so I side on, I'm with this latter point. However, I'm a pragmatist, and I think their weakness is also our weakness, right? So there's like a mutual contagion situation. Like if China falls, so does the rest of the world. So we don't have an interest in it's like when the USSR collapsed. That was bad for everybody, really. It was very, very bad for Russia. But for the entire region, it was destabilizing, right? So we don't want to, and actually, had we been a bit more Marshall Plan-y with Russia, then maybe,
we wouldn't be where we are now.
We wouldn't be where we are now, perhaps. Who knows?
Sliding doors moment. And I'd always sort of look back and wonder, I'm like, why didn't they get the Marshall Plan treatment like Germany?
Because they went with shock therapy.
Well, my suspicion is that they wanted Russia to disintegrate. It's too great a piece of land in and of itself to...
Potentially, but I think that at the time there was a real economic, this was the days of the Chicago School, and I think there was a real, Jeffrey Sachs was like the pioneer of this shock therapy treatment, and
he recanted later, didn't he?
He did recant later. He realized, I think, that it was a bad mistake. I was just looking yesterday at Poland is now doing amazingly, and it's attracting all the billionaires, and it's just phenomenally outperforming most former Soviet, communist countries. And the difference between Poland and Russia is that we didn't do shock therapy. We did very slow privatization. We didn't have really any oligarchs. We also didn't default on our domestic obligations in favor of external creditors, right? Whereas Russia was put through this experiment where they effectively did what Milei is now doing in Argentina, although on an even more, I think, extreme basis. It'll be interesting to see what happens in Argentina. Perhaps the difference between Argentina and Russia, and I don't know if I'm just speculating, is that perhaps Russia was a little bit more, like its people were so unfamiliar with market forces that they were easily exploited when those protections fell apart. Maybe the Argentinians are a little bit more savvy now, thanks to the internet, God knows what. So maybe they're not going to be as easily exploited, but I don't know. It's interesting to watch. But the point of what I'm saying is that, Poland in some ways flourished because it didn't go down the shock therapy
It's also got 35 years of history to draw on. The lessons learned because of that transition from post-Soviet states, especially Russia's, to where we are now.
And China, and what I would say is, therefore, it's not in our interests to allow China to collapse. So what you really want is a sort of off-ramping of those, like, when I say it's floundering, what I say is that the old industrial policy economic model is just not viable. They're suffering from a significant negative carry. Even the EVs are very inefficient because, again, the fundamental difference in terms of how China runs its economy relative to the West is that it has a quota-based sort of targeting mechanism at the heart of its GDP model, which means, Michael Pettis again says this a lot, which is that people sort of think when China predicts it's going to have 5% GDP or whatever, that it's sort of like, is it going to happen or is it not, right? But actually, it will always happen because China does everything it can to achieve its core targets that create those numbers.
Yeah, because I see two tracks of China talk all the time as well. One, there was is it Edward Chang? Something Chang. And he's just basically been dooming China for 30 years, saying the collapse is imminent. And then I speak to other people. Well, I spoke to one French entrepreneur. Maybe you've seen him. He's Arnaud Bertrand.
Yeah, I've met him.
You've met him? Okay.
Yeah.
I've interviewed him online. He's a fascinating character, especially as he doesn't quite fit the mold for a lot of people. He's a tech entrepreneur who's lived in China and is he comes across as an advocate for what they're doing, or it's the effectiveness
he's a
of what they're doing.
hyperbull, and I would say, I think, having met him, he's a very nice guy, and I think face to face we were able to, have a very civilized and You know, we didn't agree on all most points, but like it was very civilized debate, and we respected each other's different perspectives. But I do think his sort of, he sometimes lacks context, and I think he is so one-sided on the pro-China side that he doesn't. I mean, he has this sort of mental worldview that everything bad comes from the West and the Western model.
You think he does?
I think he does a little bit. And although that said, like every now and then when I corrected him on a few points, like he concedes. He's not, I wouldn't say he's an ideologue.
Yeah.
So, but I question some of the framing that he naturally defaults to.
Yeah. I really value reading his point of view, because I don't get that in very many places, of someone who's actually lived there, operated there for any period of time with an entrepreneur's lens, who's not Chinese.
I mean, that is all very valid, and I think you have to appreciate that.
Yeah.
But I think it still overlooks some of the control factors and how controlling the system that is the Chinese Communist Party is.
Does he dispute that?
I think yes, to some degree.
That it's not a controlling political framework or government.
You see, this is where, like, if we have censorship here in the West, I'm pretty sure, based on my own sourcing and based on the people I know who have operated as journalists in China, and I've known a number who have been arrested and beyond that, like, it is not a place where you can get free, objective discourse, and they have an absolute obsession with maintaining face, right? And so, like with most things, you can have the facts, but it's how you frame the facts that sort of asserts whether something is good or bad, right?
We do have journalists arrested. I'm not saying it's exactly the same, but we don't live up to our own ideals in this country.
And I'm not suggesting, and I wouldn't say, I'm the first one to critique what's going on. But I mean, personally, I actually think a lot of the problems we have in journalism today are, and within the analyst community in the West, is also bowing to the pressure of Chinese interests. So I think, an example is simply like the Top Gun film, when, because of the market demands of China, if you want to sell in China, you have to basically, take out Tom Cruise's Taiwan patch, off his jacket and things like that, right?
Don't they just make a different version for China?
Yeah.
Do we have to watch that version?
No, the cost economics are such that you make one film. And so they say, so that was the big controversy with the Top Gun Maverick sequel, was that, for years, Hollywood had started making more and more concessions to be able to appeal to a wider audience. And Top Gun was like, no, we're not going to change it. And then what happened is that China said, we're not going to distribute Top Gun in China, therefore. And Top Gun people were like, okay, well, we don't care. And then China made its own equivalent of Top Gun, which was called something else, Born to Fly or something, I can't remember. And wasn't as good, frankly. Not that I've tried to see it, but I'm particularly biased towards Tom Cruise films. But that's another story. So that's the point. And that's a good example of how Chinese sort of norms infiltrate Western norms. And that's my point that I was trying to make earlier, is that the open society tends to absorb the policies of the closed society rather than the other way around. And this is what Pettis says as well.
It's interesting you say that, because I see something different happening, and it's a lot more pernicious and local than I perceive your description being, because I think there have always been local forces who have looked upon authoritarian regimes with envy and wanted to do very similar things here. So it's not like we needed anybody to influence our society in order for us to do it. We just needed, those people simply just needed the opportunity to be able to implement them. And we're seeing that with the digitization of society, for example, where commercial enterprise, perhaps certain wings of the political apparatus are very interested in getting a surveillance state closer to reality. or perhaps a tighter surveillance state. Some people argue we've already got one right now. And so I think a lot of people look to China and go, why can't we have cheap labor with no standards or labor standards? Why can't we have cheaper labor here? And they look at it as like, how? And they've been conspiring to get that here.
I don't think that makes sense to me. So I would say that I think you're right. There are naturally all sorts of weird interest groups across the West, some of whom want all sorts of authoritarian structures. I think, and this is probably my, cultural heritage, which is Polish, influencing things, is that I think we still underappreciate just how draconian and how controlled this Chinese society is, and to what degree the internet is not free there, and the degree to which they're trying to fundamentally restructure the IP level, or not the IP, but like the protocol level of the internet, to make it sort of, impossible to completely control it from the bottom up. You're a tech keeper, so you're more likely to understand what I'm saying, than I am. But that's my understanding, is that they're calling it the splinter net because it would be at the kind of infrastructure level. You wouldn't be able to circumvent through VPNs or other things. They would control the entire stack.
You say that, but I'll tell you what. The people in power now, or in politics now, either Labour or Conservative, both of them, if they could just snap their fingers and implement the exact same system, they would absolutely do it.
So that's my point, is like that has been in China for a long time, and they're actually advocating at the UN level and through all these sort of electronic internet society things. I don't know what they're called. And naturally, there is, I think, in Europe especially, a general kind of sympathy for that mentality. In part because, we, unlike the Americans, have always had a sort of, sympathetic relationship with the welfare state. We like our welfare state. We like planned economies. Europe especially has had planning for a while. And it's worked quite well for us because we've had, let's face it, Europe is a lovely place to live. It is, it's gorgeous. We have long holidays. We have great, mostly throughout history, we've had great public services, great education. It's all free at the point of use. And this is fantastic, right? So I completely get why a lot of Europeans think, well, maybe the Chinese way is better. But they overlook like fundamental problems, which is like that China comes with control, but it has no welfare state. Actually, Chinese model is not very good for welfare state. They have no welfare state. So there's a fundamental difference there. That they reinvest all their surplus in just like continuing their mercantilistic, hegemonic advance across the world, not in rewarding their own population, right? It's incredibly precarious society. And GDP per capita is still like very low. It's like at I think under 20,000 or something dollars. Funnily enough, the UK's GDP per capita I think is maybe 50 or 60. So even we're better than China even today, right? America's is like off the charts somewhere. So you have this I think this mentality that oh, well, maybe the Chinese way isn't that bad, but you overlook that part. But you're right. I think the surveillance stuff, it appeals to the control elements here. But I'd make two counterpoints, which is that if the big fight of our times is actually maintaining freedom and a kind of Western Enlightenment model for the world, you're not going to be able to fend off a totalitarian state which already has entrenched surveillance mechanisms and a command economy by being all laissez-faire about it. You're just not going to be able, like, if that was the case, we would never have had to have rationing during the war. We would never have had to, like, have, all sorts of, like, ministries of economic warfare. And, during the Second World War, we abandoned a lot of the freedoms of liberal society because there's just no way we could compete with Hitler or win the war if we didn't also, unfortunately, take on many of those same mechanisms for our own society, right?
But doesn't that go back to your I guess the post that we started this conversation with is like, all of these things are happening as if there has been a war.
Yes.
There is no war. And yet we've been asked to forego our civil liberties. The posture, the political posture here, the policy posture is for ratcheting up tighter control and surveillance of the citizens. And so we're seeing that with, they're couching it in terms of good for society, protecting children, but we know all that's bullshit. We know it's all bullshit.
I agree with you 100%. However, I think the mistake people make is in attributing it all to a singular they, right? Because it isn't a singular they. It is competing theys. Like the entire, West is... Beauty of the West.
Can you tell me of a faction, a large enough identifiable faction within the Conservatives and Labour who have been successfully pushing for more liberty, digital freedoms? Because they're losing that fight. If there's anybody there at all, they've lost that fight. I have not seen anything that sort of wound back a measure of digital surveillance in the last 20 years that I've been here.
There are 3 elements that I would say. One is just the general competition element. Mm-hmm. You're not going to compete. You're not going to be able to compete with a, aspiring world power that isn't committed to Enlightenment values if you just allow for maximum freedom the way we used to.
What is that an admission of?
It is an admission that we are in a war, potentially, where an open system, as I keep saying, is going to absorb the system, the methods and mechanisms of a closed totalitarian state, because it's easier for an open.
That's a massive concession, though.
No. So there's a secondary element to what I'm saying. So number one, you have this realization that just generally efficiency and growth, due to the imbalances that were created by the Chinese industrial policy, it forced, this is another element of what Michael Pettis says, it inevitably forces, just through how balance of payments work, the Western economies to have to specialize in non-material, non-atom-based services. So finance, digital, and general services, right? And we have outperformed on that front. Like, we lead in finance, we lead in digital, and we lead in service culture. Like, that is, like, America at the end of the day, have a nice day. It is that world.
Yeah.
Some people might dispute that, but you know what I mean. The customer is always right. So, so from that perspective, you cannot compete on bricks and mortar, because you're just like when they tried to build the factory in China. It's never going to be cost competitive for as long as subsidization is going on to the degree it is going on in China. Why is it going on? Because they basically allow for slave labor, and you've got this lying flat phenomenon where people have just they have nothing to live for, because you work, but you never can save. There's nothing left at the end of the week, because literally any savings you make, you can't put them anywhere. You can't put them in the stock market, which for years was like forced to, like, Xi's policy was just basically crashing the market by decree, making sure there was no growth in the stock market. You can't put it in the banks, because there's no return on your investments there. You can't put in crypto, that's banned. Like, you have nowhere, like, even if you manage to save a little bit, where are you going to put it? So people buy gold. That's why there's this massive gold rush, because they can't put it abroad. Literally, like, so what are you going to do? And you don't have any welfare. So how are you going to save for your, like, retirement? You can't have children. You can only have one child. Most people have only one child. There is no way, like, you literally have nowhere to put your wealth. So in that sort of situation, how are you going to compete? You can't compete in the West. So we compete on what we can, which was digital services. And unfortunately, the byproduct of that is surveillance state, because data becomes the new oil under that framework. Would it have been different if it would have been less extreme if there had been more of a balanced approach? Perhaps, I don't know, but we're down that road now. So so then you've got to ask, then I look at it from the Ted Kaczynski perspective, which I know is a bit weird to, like,
the Unabomber. For everyone who's the name is familiar to you, but you're wondering who that was. That's the Unabomber.
Yes, so the Unabomber. But he was genuinely quite a genius. Like he was.
I think so. Yeah.
I'm not condoning what he did, but his manifesto made the simple point that by definition, technological progress is always going to lead to a more collectivized and less privacy-orientated system model. Because
I would put to you that actually surveillance is a policy choice. You can have the technical infrastructure that transmits and collects all this data, but then, requiring KYC documentation to access your phone, banning VPNs. These are policy decisions that the government's making
that
to enforce it.
Relative to China, right? The US just has tried to have its cake and eat it on its front as much as possible, way more than China. If China has the option to do a centralized system, it always does the centralized system. There are none of what you're talking about.
We have more room to maneuver. There's no doubt about that. I'm not saying we are like China.
Like crypto has been enabled. Sorry.
Oh, that was you. I thought it was Aussie.
That was me.
I thought it was Aussie.
So crypto is still allowed. We've just regulated it, so it's been embraced finally. We've had the battle over cryptography for years. All those things happened in the West. They would never have happened in China, right? So what I'm saying is that if the general, as per the Unabomber manifesto, if the general path of least resistance is towards a more surveillance and centralized system, then the West has done its damn best to make sure there are as many frictions in play to protect privacy. And
it has? You think it's done its best to put frictions in place?
I think so, given all those all that stuff came from the free market, crypto, all of that, all the cypherpunk stuff, all of that.
Hang on, but
didn't it come from the free market?
When you say the West, I thought we're comparing political architectures here, right? Yeah. Political systems. Cryptocurrency, Bitcoin did not come from the political architecture, right?
Well, it did a little bit.
No, not really.
I think it did.
How?
Because it comes out of whichever particular, creation story you go for. There's none of them. I don't think there's any of them that stems from a pro-centralization mentality. Like the cypherpunks, like if we can agree it stemmed from cypherpunk.
When I say
values.
From the political architecture, I mean, as a policy decision from government.
So my point is that it was born in the West because the cypherpunks were allowed to operate in the West.
Yeah.
They would have been shut down in China, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so then it's been a sort of progressive sort of struggle to make sure that those decentralized systems get embedded into the wider infrastructure.
Oh, okay. So here's where we've got a bit of friction. I make a distinction between the people and the system.
Right.
And so the people in the West, in my conversation, the points that I make are distinct from the system in the West. And very often, yes, the system permits people to do what they want. But what then happens is a follow-up clampdown by the system on the people. And we've seen that happen with the internet and the rise of social media, and then the political system recognizing the profound impacts that it has on people and their ability to control or subvert official narratives and to organize themselves.
Absolutely.
And then the system says, we're going to clamp down on that.
Yes, absolutely. And
Always.
but that is still because that's a function of the tension in a democratic society between the impulse to be completely libertarian and without any protection, and the impulse to have a protectionist and paternalistic system. That's the beauty of the democratic Western world, so we don't totally abandon paternalism.
But I would say it goes beyond protective and paternalistic. And we've seen that with the Ed Snowden revelations, right? That entire documented archive was not a paternalistic posture.
No.
It was a surveillance and control mechanism.
So going back to the Ted Kaczynski concept, the path of least resistance is towards hyper-centralization and no privacy and, say, the kind of Orwellian boot stamping on society for the rest of eternity, right? Now, my point is that in the China model, that is a path of least resistance with very few frictions. In the Western model, it's a little bit more complicated because our journey is kind of like this. And our journey is like we overcorrect because we feel like maybe we need some more protections. but we have enough freedoms embedded in the architecture of our political systems to allow usually pushback against that overcorrection. And that's why you see this kind of jagged approach. And it makes us a lot less efficient than the centralized system. And that's why we have fallout from Brexit and years of chaos. And, we are chaotic. Relative.
I agree with that. But the point is, the ratchet only goes one way.
But that is the force of the, I think, of the path of least resistance. So, which is what Ted Kaczynski mathematically kind of proved, right? So the point is, progress comes with that, but it's about always allowing for at least the mechanism to correct for totalitarian overreach. However, one of the points where the over-paternalistic overcorrection is justified in the West sometimes is when it's needed to offset, so when you've got a rising hegemon who is only centralized, let's put it in Star Wars terms, right? So you've got the rising empire and you've got Darth Vader. Well, in that case, the Rebel Alliance is never going to win against Darth Vader if it doesn't also deploy. I mean, it's always got creativity on its side and all sorts of wonderful things that, we excel at because of our chaos. But we're never going, or maybe decentralization, and the Houthis are very good at that as well, versus a centralized, mega system. But by and large, if you're going to have to face off with I've forgotten the actual Imperial Army stormtroopers. If you're going to face off a storm, you're going to need clout and you're going to need some power, right? And not always. I mean, perhaps you might just be able to get a good one shot into the Death Star, but by and large, until you get that opportunity to do that one shot, you have to sadly make some concessions on freedoms. The issue is this state of exception, right? Carl Schmitt, is it Carl Schmitt, who came up with this idea, the real tyranny in the West is the risk of or rather totalitarianism in the West is always a function of how the state of exception is managed in that democracy. So what allows for the state of exception? Because if it's overdone, so you might argue for exceptional powers because X, Y, or Z, you're facing an existential risk. But if, in Caesar in ancient Rome, you maintain those powers 20 years on after the emergency has left. Yeah. That is your point of
well, that's one of the
risk.
reasons why I found it a little bit alarming, the way I understood your description of a sort of an ongoing war between civilizations or systems, is because that is an ongoing issue. It's just the mere existence of China and the mere existence of the West means that there's that tension and there's a kind of war going on, which implies that some of these freedoms that we experience in the West should be on the table in order to be able to be competitive. And I find that really objectionable. That we need to do that, because what we're conceding, and I think the way you've described it is essentially saying that we have the weaker system, and we have the inferior system.
I don't think we have a weaker system. I think look at how we excel in digital services. That's not that is a massive strength.
The point that you made was that the open system will take on the values of the closed system
very often. Yes, unless you guard it through very conscious policy making, right? And bake in all these human rights issues and all that sort of stuff. And actually you see that now. So you say, and I agree with you 100%, that the overcorrection in places like Europe against freedoms that we thought were, effectively guaranteed is very alarming. But it's thanks to the architecture of the system itself that we can use those very same sort of statutes to fight fire with fire. And I think yesterday I saw that Alex Berenson, whether you like his work or not, he was one of the critics of the COVID vaccine, right? And I think he left I think he was at the New York Times, and he left and became an independent media guy. And he was being censored on X, and everyone tried to gaslight him that it wasn't a thing. And finally, he took the government to court, and he won. He won a 6-figure payout for having been censored and having his constitutional rights effectively abused by the government when the government was interfering behind the scenes at X or whatever it was, Twitter then. And I think that shows you that, that's an example of like in the here and now, those powers can try and abuse the system, but the architecture at the base level protects our freedoms.
Yeah. I fear, and I see them being eroded. I see that architecture protecting our freedoms being eroded.
Well, that's when policymakers try to actually unwind those constitutional protections that have been with us and allowed for freedom and enlightenment, all that good stuff for so long. That's when you have to start to worry. And this is actually my concern, is that when that kind of pressure is coming from the Chinese side. This is where I disagree with Arnaud, because that is definitely the source of all, like at the UN level. So
because they're doing it, we need to do it? Is that what you mean? Because they're doing it, it gives them a competitive advantage.
That the Chinese want to reconstitute it at the architectural level. Like one of their key issues is like human rights. Like they don't want to observe human rights, right? So they want to.
Do you think we observe human rights?
No, I think I think the West is always muddling through. We aspire to protect human rights, but we get stuff wrong all the time. But thanks to some, core programming in the system, there's always at least a hope. Not to put it all in Star Wars terms, but there's always a hope of reconciliation. There's always a hope of correcting for our story is one where like pockets of darkness come and go. But thankfully, there's enough of like muscle memory, or at least enough infrastructure in there that protects our freedoms that it can always seed a rebellion.
I see it the other way around, actually. I see a persistent darkness that's interrupted by pockets of light. Because the political architecture is constantly indifferent to human rights, and it's only a few belligerent activists, and some in very high places, like some very well qualified and accomplished lawyers who lead these campaigns as well. That sometimes they break through with a victory, but it's always against an enormous tide of the deep state, civil service, military-industrial complex, and both Labour and the Conservatives actually in lockstep pushing those policies. Like I said, it's always a ratchet in one way, and occasionally there's a glimmer of hope with these belligerent activist types who win. And that sort of, when I criticize anything in the West, it's from a basis of what our ideals are, not in comparison to it doesn't suggest China is better.
But you see, I think that's an error comparison? Because I think there is a architectural difference in their system, and that's not to do with the people, and it's not to do with like I think so much of the stuff that China does is amazing, but it's the architecture of their governance system that I have an issue. It's just a bad model. And it doesn't even at this moment create wealth, right, for the people, right? Yeah. So prosperity is floundering.
I know, but it's really hard to argue it doesn't create wealth for the people, considering, the 50-year march out of poverty.
Well, yes and no. That is a very selective representation of prosperity in China, because it's been very much guided by the, centralized government hand, which means that wealth has been directed specifically where the Chinese government wants to showcase, prosperity, whether that's building white elephant projects like massive bridges, which I'm not saying like infrastructure is important. And certainly the Chinese have proven that they can build mega airports and bridges and all that stuff, and that's great. And the US system has massively underperformed on that front. But at the same time,
than that, though? Aren't they doing more than these? I mean, maybe I'm sure they have white elephant infrastructure projects.
but when you look at like the distribution of wealth across the country, we see only a fraction of it in the standout cities. There's still a huge amount of poverty across China. As I said, on a GDP per capita basis, it's not at the hegemon superpower level. Like most European states still have a much higher quality of life than anybody in China, right? So you have this extreme wealth inequality in China, much more so than you do in America.
Is that a fair basis for comparison, though? Because but that's also the UK is poorer than Alabama, for example.
But it's still richer than China.
No, but let's just compare. How many people in the UK would want to live, would look at Alabama with sort of envy about their living standards?
Remember, I mean, there are other issues with the UK, which is that it's basically a dependency of America that never recognized that it's a dependency of America. And we'd probably be much better off just like either joining, like we need to be part of like some sort of cohesive European, union of some kind, whether it's Europe or America, it doesn't matter, but we're not going to stand alone, because the only way the UK outperforms alone is by being a parasitic state that like effectively thrives on financialization and offshore and all sorts of undercutting on that front, which is not, for me, a system that is sustainable or desirable for the world, right? So the UK is an exception on that front anyway. But my point is that we have a problem with wealth inequality enough in America, but it's still completely, I think compared to China, it is the number, it's a fatter tail, right? So yes, maybe the extremes in the West might be more extreme, but there are fatter tails on the, there is no middle class in the same sense. That there is really an absence of that whole middling effect.
Okay. But I guess another question, another way for me to think about this is, do you think Chinese society is better off today versus 10, 20, 30 years ago across all stratas of society?
I mean, I think the framing of that question is unfair, because progress,
who's it unfair to?
Right? That's not how you measure growth. Like the way you measure growth is like missed opportunity. Like the question should be, how much further would their growth be if not for their ways? And also, to what degree has that growth in China come at the compromise of other people's growth, right? So what you want is a net positive growth model, right? Where everyone has a win-win. China's model is mercantilistic, which means their growth tends to come at the cost of other people's growth. So it's more like growth that they've stolen from the rest of the world, right? Rather than co-produced on a commonwealth basis. That's the issue, right?
Haven't we been complicit partners in their growth?
Well, yes, and that goes back to our original conversation, which is where I think we entertained this because we thought it wouldn't take that long for them to liberalize. And then if they liberalize, they would share the growth and it would all be mutually beneficial to everybody, and the world would like thrive and everyone would have, everyone would benefit. That was the original liberal dream. And I don't actually, I'm quite sympathetic to that. I think that's why I don't think you can be. I'm very critical of the Davos elite and all the kind of multinationals.
Yeah.
But I'm not. I'm realistic as well, and I think they weren't expecting for China to be so resistant to liberalization or to spreading the wealth domestically. Again, I emphasize like this is the stuff that just does not come out in the Arnaud side of the equation, which is that there is no welfare state in China. Everything you have to there is no guarantee. It's not France, which I love. I love France, but France is like, what I call capitalism with joie de vivre characteristics, whereas China is capitalism with basically no welfare characteristics whatsoever.
Do you think a country, a nation of China's scale, because I look at one of its neighbors, do you think India, can a country of China's scale come out of poverty at such a rapid rate with liberal economic policies. Because then when I look at India, and India may not be your sort of poster boy of some of the policies perhaps, you might be a proponent of, but it's closer to that on a spectrum than China is. Yet when we have a look at the economic performance of both countries over the last 50 years, one is clearly an economic powerhouse and the other is not.
I don't know so much. I think the Indian economy is really underappreciated in the global sort of system. Not only, have they made huge strides in terms of scientific advances, in terms of, their resilience in terms of commodities and, some of the digitization, so much stuff comes from India these days. Whether it's what's it called? I've forgotten. They have one of the biggest and most adaptable refineries in the world, right? They have they landed on the moon with their
With
lander
space program. Sure.
That was it. I mean, so they are keeping up, but they are also creating a system where effectively they are allowing for free market forces and political, the Modi situation is complex, right? Because it's like the populace, India's very split. It's as polarized as any other country on the politics. But I think wherever you look, there's an Indian billionaire. And I think to suggest that India hasn't had huge leap in terms of quality of life.
They have, but have they kept up with China?
Well, it depends how you measure. It depends how you measure wealth. It really depends on, do they have the sort of standout, Shanghai style big skyscraper cityscape kind of effect? Perhaps not. But their latest, I think it's Delhi Airport. I think it's Delhi Airport. I might be wrong. It's an airport. I think they decided to set aside $1 billion or something in terms of whatever the budget was to just spend on aesthetics, which is amazing. Every other airport in the world you go to is just a completely soulless, carbon copy of every other airport in the world. And that's a design that China has also implemented everywhere, this sort of soulless city, steel-based design. Whereas the Indians decide, well, no, actually, we think we're just going to waste this value on making things pretty, which is a beautiful cultural kind of, so maybe they haven't had this exceptional growth, but that's because they've decided to spend it on some elements on just beautifying their system or doing these weird, quirky cultural things, which have their own value.
I've just looked up GDP per capita, and the disparity is so great. I'm questioning whether it's even accurate. Because
I don't know GDP. I mean, but India starts from an incredibly low base like China, but it hasn't got the same, history in terms of, protectionism that China has, right?
Yeah.
And that's one of the issues.
So China's is about 15. In 2024, it was $13,303. This is the World Bank figures, right? India's is 2,695. So if I'm looking at systems producing outcomes for the betterment of their people, I would be like, well, China's clearly doing a lot better raising people out of poverty than India is. And we're not comparing apples with apples here. It's just because the scale of the countries, and I'm picking them primarily because of the scale of the two countries are comparable, but also they're kind of not quite at opposite ends of the spectrum if we say total control authoritarian and laissez-faire capitalism, but they're kind of a good comparison to make.
But it's not just about the economic model with India. It's that sort of China gets to bolt into effectively an economic union de facto with America to some degree, thanks to this sort of joint venture law that they start in the 70s, where American capital gets to kind of come in on preferential terms, and they it's incredibly lucrative for American companies to invest and set up factories in China, right? And so it draws a lot of capital that way. And it, even though technically it's obviously its own state and sovereign country, it's indirectly kind of part of this trade. Once it joins WTO, it profiteers at the expense of the US, and by not playing by the rules, right? India is more of a straight shooter, right? So it doesn't take advantage of those rules in the same way. And more to the point, India comes from a heritage where it used to be part of one of the biggest trading blocs in the world, which is the old British Empire. So post-war, and of course it goes through the stress and the destabilization of the partitions that with Pakistan, etc. So you have a different narrative, but also this situation where I think India has to go it alone a lot more than China does. Because it's suddenly bolted out of its old. I mean, it's part of the Commonwealth, but at the point where Britain basically abandons the Commonwealth in favor of the EU, it loses all those advantages in terms of trade. So it takes. I mean, I'm not an expert in India, so I don't want to completely.
I brought it up just for conversation's sake.
I think it's a worthwhile counter example for sure. But I do always feel like we underestimate the Indian economic system and their amazing potential, and also their capacity to I mean, in terms of moving up this skills ladder, the Indians have been doing it for such a long time. I mean, especially it's I guess less on the scientific front. I'm making a terrible generalization here, but there is such a cultural respect for professionalism in India. So all parents want to have a doctor,
a lawyer, or a mathematician, or a scientist. Right. Yeah. They and that seems to hold when they become immigrants as well. If you've ever had. If you've ever studied with Indians at school, you'd know that they're fastidious about doing their homework, or at least because of parental pressure, if nothing else.
And incredibly tenacious society. And so is China. Chinese, I mean, I would never want to.
No, we're talking systems. We're not talking, we're not comparing people as though one is superior to the other. I have great hopes for India. I think many of the problems that the West has with China could be solved with India.
Yes, and I think, the question then maybe is what is holding India back? I mean, is it the fact that, is it energy dependency? Is it, a lack of, natural resources? Is it sort of the sheer population size? Remember, I think, China did have a one-child policy for a long time. I don't believe that ever happened. Anything like that happened in India.
I've heard it described as being more unwieldy or not as easy to organize across the various regions. It's almost like dozens of different countries to
very
coordinate.
Decentralized.
Yeah,
so this is, I think, in that sense, it allows for more of that decentralized spirit, perhaps. But like I said, I'm not an expert in Indian economics, but I get the impression that just because of the fact that it is less centralized and more in keeping with British legal systems and the general kind of Western structural, the Western bureaucratic norms, that it won't benefit from those centralized mechanisms in the same way.
Something you are an expert in, media. I want to talk about your evolution and the discoveries that you made, the realizations. Perhaps you had them while you were also already at the Financial Times, but you made a post some time ago about the difficulties internally to be as, first of all, the commercial pressures that are sometimes felt by an organization and how that changes their very nature, despite starting perhaps at a point of truth telling. So maybe, if you could pick up the story and take us through that, because I found that really illuminating. I hadn't heard it said by another journalist in quite that way.
So just because I can talk about this for so long, which element in particular?
Okay, you said the Financial Times had started at a point where it had a fairly concentrated, influential audience to which it could speak quite truthfully and frankly about the realities of the economic system.
Yeah. So, yes, I mean the FT is an interesting. I think it's quite a unique media establishment.
It's the preeminent financial publication in possibly Europe,
if not the world. Like the Wall Street Journal is its main challenger, but there is a sort of element of prestige, I think, associated with the FT, and it goes through different episodes in its history. So it's never it iterates, and it's so there are times in its history when it's less focused on domestic issues and does try to be the paper of influence, across, internationally, right? And so it goes through these waves of being more international, more domestic, more international, more domestic, and it echoes in some ways what's happening in the UK. So when the UK goes through its big bang and deregulation and financialization sort of era, the FT becomes incredibly proactive on the UK front and following UK companies, and I think that is the heritage of a lot of the my sort of generation of reporters were trained by that generation that benefited from that sort of very city focused mentality. And when I joined the FT, it was still, I would say, UK centered, but it was starting to become more globalized, right? So it was going through that next phase iteration. And as part of that, I think it changes the tone of how it writes its stories, because it's appealing to a different demographic. So when you're talking to locals, you're effectively speaking in your own sort of jargon that is understandable to the UK, but and that in its own way is a filter. It's or a barrier to access, because nobody who goes into the newsagent who doesn't speak high finance is going to understand what's necessarily being written about, right? So you have a natural compartmentalization just because you're speaking to a native audience who is very, focused on these issues. Now, as it internationalizes, it has to appeal to a broader audience. Not all of them are native English speakers. So it has to make itself more accessible. It has to kind of speak more plainly. And I think that in the latest iteration of that wave coincides with digitalization and social media. And so suddenly that ability to speak to just the elite is somehow compromised, because A, you're speaking more plainly, and B, you're being transmitted over sort of social media, which can be accessed by any Tom, Dick, or Harry. So a natural, I think, risk aversion comes into play, where you have to, I think the paper becomes less bold.
What's the risk? What's the risk in that?
I think the risk is this cancellation risk, and this idea that you might lose advertisers, or that was for a long time, I think, the main sort of Damocles sort of hanging over the institution's head, is that if you say something that is considered, in some ways controversial or
so the vernacular of high finance doesn't quite gel or reconcile with, say, woke politics.
Yeah.
And suddenly it's taken in a particular way, maybe, at face value, but it just doesn't gel with that. And that generates a controversy that's difficult for advertisers to
and so you end up with this risk aversion, or you end up with a sort of institutional bias towards not saying anything provocative. and coasting to the kind of consensus, like always taking the consensus line or whatever is the safety route. Or, in the case of, say, The Economist, you become a counter-indicator very, very often because you're almost sort of markets usually benefit from contrary perspectives. And if you're so safety orientated and you're just telling the market with consensus, it's kind of like, we're not really providing anything of value. And so that's where the whole Jim Cramer inverse Jim Cramer thing comes from. And so I think it's also the CNBCs. It's not just the FT. And that compartmentalization used to allow for really honest and matter-of-fact sort of discussions where you could speak plainly about things in ways that just can't be said now. Not because it's necessarily more controversial. It's just that due to the broader reach, you can't assume people know the background to all these. They can be taken the wrong way. Things can be kind of misconstrued, or people haven't done the learnings that like the high and mighty have already, been through.
But it could be interpreted as like seeking refuge in conspiracy and using it as an excuse, like using controversy as an excuse, because people still want to have those. But so your role at FT prior to the popularization would have been giving an accurate reading and assessment of the ongoings in world finance, global finance, particularly from a UK city point of view. And then when that changes, and then you develop a higher level of exposure amongst people who are not accustomed to the language, the directness, the vernacular, jargon, all of that. And perhaps even, like you said, they don't have a policy context or even economic context to understand it. And they have their own set of jargon and context through which they take bits and pieces and then push it out to generate controversy. I've seen that play out. I've been in a form of media for about 5 years now. So I understand the temptation and I understand the mechanism for that to happen. But then I think, internally, you still have a sense that you've changed like organization, or is there a realization that organizationally you've changed? Or do people just go, well, this is what's now required from me and this is the sort of content that we're going to put forward?
I think it's like boiling frog. It creeps up on you. And so I think you get this sort of risk aversion appearing in your daily, newsroom meetings where it used to be, highly encouraged to speak out and sort of put out more, not controversial, but at least kind of push back a little bit against assumptions. And suddenly, COVID was the key example where I think there was just this chilling effect where nobody was prepared to criticize the policy because there was a fear that if you did, you would have some sort of internal demotion, or people would frown upon you, or you would lose internal currency status.
Because I've worked in large organizations as well. I'm not the sort of person who does well in those places. I don't have that person. I just don't have the personality. You could probably.
That's a good thing as far as I'm concerned.
It's good from a personal integrity point of view. It's not good for your bank balance.
You're probably not good at I wouldn't hire you to build a bridge. That's fine.
Yeah, no, I'm not. Yeah, no.
You're not going to comply, but that's fine.
I could if I wanted to. The thing is, I don't want to. That's my problem. I don't want to do it. How does that realization occur? Because, the Financial Times, I don't imagine that you have a very elastic audience. Like the people who buy the Financial Times or read it are more or less habitual readers. They're industry, and so they need to read it, right? And so, how does it dawn upon people internally that they shouldn't speak about a topic such as COVID? Because you're a financial organization, you're not really a political organization, social commentary, all that sort of stuff.
Well, that's what mystified me, because I thought the reputation of the FT was saying uncomfortable truths out loud, largely because markets don't tolerate, ambiguity on that front. And they're very honest. Like, you're either going to the signal is in the data and the market feedback, right? So you can lie to yourselves politically, but you can't lie to the markets because of information, just efficiency, right? So that's what mystified me, because it just made no sense to me. And funnily enough, and I had this kind of total discrepancy between what I was hearing internally in the newsroom and what my trader contacts and people working markets were saying. And I found actually in my own personal experience, and I don't know if it might be just unique to me, but in my experience, everyone I knew who was fairly competent in markets could see explicitly that there was something not right going on, that people had misinterpreted the safety risk kind of equation, and the cost benefits just didn't make sense.
That was kind of like a function of a prediction market on COVID. Like you can see it in the stock price.
Oh my God, could you imagine if there was a prediction market now in terms of like waves and second waves? God, that would be brilliant.
Well, that's why I'm not completely against prediction markets. I understand the degenerate side of gambling on things and the propensity to engage in all sorts of corrupt behaviors as well. But there's also this sort of information forcing mechanism, truth forcing mechanism that they can be in really important moments. Yeah. So I'm not totally against it. And I've wondered whether or not like, would I go into it like a brand partnership with one? I probably lean on maybe if we could sort of message it, like retain the messaging or contain the messaging in a focused way, but not in a sort of degenerate way. But because it matters, like the ethics of it matter to me. I definitely see a value to society in them, but then there's like 70, 80, maybe even 90% of it is just degeneracy.
Where do you see the degeneracy? Is it because of the potential to
it's the corruption,
to benefit from insider information?
Yeah. And well, no, not necessarily that. It's because I think it forces out people. It incentivizes people with insider information
to get it out there,
and we see it manifest in the price, which way the price moves. But it's more, more on the frivolous stuff, the personal stuff,
like
there's
having
just
a punt.
some distasteful.
But is that different to what the bookies here?
Yeah, but I'm not partnering with them either. Yeah. So look, I don't mean that they shouldn't exist in society. It's just whether or not I would partner with them.
Yeah, no, look, gambling is a tricky social thing, isn't it? Because
I have family who think the whole stock market is gambling. So you're just betting on whether it goes up or down. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they are right to a certain degree. Right. Except there is, you could argue there's a capital allocation element to it, right?
It's all speculative, right?
Sure, but I mean, if I was to steel man the case for markets, is that there is a real sort of, if they're working and functioning properly, they're trying the efficiency, the speculation is about assigning goods and commodities in ways that maximizes efficiency for everybody and creates more wealth. Like that's giving them, the benefit of the doubt. The difference of gambling markets is that the speculation historically is simply, profiteering on a fundamental kind of negative sum or zero sum basis, that there's no positive allocation of capital. Now, what's interesting about the current iteration of prediction markets is that maybe there is going to be some useful allocation of that prediction, because if it starts to, I think of it like in terms of a human brain, if it starts to provide a sort of like a model of how things could be, like scenario planning, like when all these kind of very high and mighty NGO type policy places often do scenario planning, right? In terms of how to pre-plan against disasters or whatever. But they're kind of constructed by panels, but imagine like a market generated prediction system doing this scenario stuff. I think that might serve an interesting function in a more AI-based future, because the AI can kind of respond to, it's like a imagination kind of effect, right? The system is developing an imagination. It's sort of going, oh, like when you take a action with your body and you're like, well, the probabilities if I do that, I'll be able to pick it up, right? That's the I'm making a prediction and I get, so maybe there's some sort of weird system-wide usefulness from that, as and when the system becomes more intelligent as a whole.
Yeah. I think their usefulness in terms of accuracy on any particular topic is going to be a function of liquidity. And I don't think any of the markets are at that point yet.
No.
But
and also it doesn't help that it's banned in so many jurisdictions. So it's not really, although I noticed yesterday that the prediction that Jesus is going to come back has gone up from 1% to 4% in 2026.
300% increase.
There you go.
I want to get back to your experience at the FT, and in particular, in the post that you made, you said the business model collapsed at some point.
Yes. So the business model, I mean, this is not unique to the FT.
No, not at all. Not at all. No. It's a fairly universal description of the broader media landscape. We're just giving us, your particular experience.
I think obviously we start to compete for advertising bugs with the social media companies, and this is problematic on many fronts, because they just have so much more reach, and they have the capacity to allocate digital advertising in a bespoke way, right? With the newspapers are a bit late to this, like. They look at it from like their own segment. They do audience research, don't get me wrong. And like the FT has a very valuable audience, which can be monetized in the data markets because of that demographic. But the beauty of the social media platforms is that they can do really highly targeted advertising on an increasingly individual basis. So I think there's that sort of anomaly, but also the advertising ends up flowing to 2016, you get this fake news crisis where everyone thinks that Facebook and the social media companies are not really filtering what people are saying online, and that all sorts of like nonsense is being interpreted by mostly boomers as being true when it's not true, because they don't see the difference between an editorially curated product and this kind of like self-generated content with no filters whatsoever, right? And that's where they gain a massive economic advantage, because they don't have to invest in all that editorial curation, right? So immediately, like even if we had the same advertising budgets, they win because they don't have all those costs. They're just letting all sorts of crap go out. Yeah. And that's when they start to take advantage and start eating, I think, the fundamental cash flow of the media businesses. It's very difficult from that point to turn the ship around, because once you go to kind of anything goes, you have to either completely abandon the kind of subsidized advertising model, which is what the FT ends up doing, because it then like focuses on subscriptions instead. But then you become a more selective and elite publication. And I think this is where we are now, is that sort of golden age where news was relatively affordable, quite, high quality news was affordable to most people, is over, largely because it got eaten up by this kind of like freemium model, cross-subsidized by advertising that didn't give a damn about the quality. And now everything's behind a paywall, and that is not sustainable for most people because it's just too expensive. But it highlights the real cost of, it shows how costly real journalism actually is. Now AI is coming in, might change things again. Could it reduce costs? Maybe a little bit, but I don't think so. I think AI, if anything, is, first of all, you'd be surprised by how resistant the established press are to using AI, because it's seen, especially the more intellectual they are, the more they see it as cheating.
Same in creative arts, for creative industries. Artists still some are either really sort of innovative and entrepreneurial, and you're like, it's a tool, I'll use it, and others are like, no, totally frowned upon.
Yes, exactly. So there's this weird cultural kind of stigma associated with using AI, and I know a lot of journalists who are like, "Oh no, I wouldn't dare! Like, that would feel too much like cheating." And it's almost like the struggle is the process. But they're going to have their lunch eaten on the sort of like commoditized news front, like the earnings reports, the sort of stuff that is very easy, that you don't really add value. So I think that's just going to undercut more and more of the conventional news business. Where it's going to be more difficult for AI, I think, to undercut, these journalists is on creative and elements or analysis, or even to this day, I think, and that's where I think they have a point, because you can see the slop. Like you can recognize slop now. You can recognize when people are using AI. Now I always say, like, I have a problem with typos because I'm dyslexic, but I'm like, it's proof of my brain being the one. I'm a bit of a hodgepodge, because sometimes I do just, on principle, use my own brain. I'm like, to hell with the typos and my weird turns of phrase. Because I'm impulsive and I just want to put it out there. And actually putting it through a filter and ChatGPT or whatever to improve it is actually arduous in its own way. So then you have to argue with ChatGPT. It's complicated, but the
iterations are tedious, right? Like they kill the will to live, really.
Exactly. So sometimes I'm just like, I can't be bothered. And but that said, it helps. Like if you're a one-man band like me at the moment, it's very useful, because I have that second filter, that editor. We discussed it earlier. That you have this editor usually that is pushing back, and now that they've I think they've done something to the algorithm so it's less agreeable, and I think that's quite good, because it's like, are you sure you want to say that? And I'm like, well, maybe you've got a point. And that's a better default, I think, for AI. Like, remember when it was really sycophantic and told you were wonderful?
I think it still is too sycophantic, to be honest. I have to tell it to just give me the answer. And even then, it just ignores you quite often. Editorial process has always been a huge filter. Some writers, I guess, appreciate the benefits of it, but for others, it's like the bane of their existence. But you mentioned sort of engagement teams, and if you're in media and you're in a small organization, you're either clued into what the algorithm rewards, or you might have engagement teams, for example. And so, as an organization, it comes to realize that this is a different game. It's changed. And so we've got to play in some way, but not in others. When you have engagement teams at a company like the FT, what are you focusing on there?
So engagement was like a weird development at the FT. So I've crept into the system early days. It was like one person doing audience engagement. It was all very, boring and vanilla. It was mainly to do with comment moderation and making sure that, everything was above board on that front. But then SEO became a thing, and suddenly you saw audience engagement people turning up in morning editorial conferences, and they would be opening the day's discussion with what did well online and what didn't do well online. And if you're doing this story on Trump, then consider using this word in your headline because it'll drive more traffic. And I think that's when it becomes problematic, because suddenly you are just a feedback system, right? You're giving the algorithm what it wants and not kind of doing things for the integrity of the story. Like you're not true to the integrity of the story, right? or to yourself rather, and that is the problem. And so people start making. I think a lot of journalists don't. I think it's more of an editor thing, but there is a sort of compromise on that front. And you see, I mean, in some ways it's not new, because when you think about tabloidization, that's what tabloids always did anyway, right? Mm-hmm. So you always did the kind of clicky, Freddie Star ate my hamster or whatever it was, right? That was the first iteration of what I'm talking about, and giving the people what they want, right? Which is the same now, but it's giving the algorithm what it wants, which is basically what the people want, what they're gonna click on. And that's fine if you understand it as a segmentation thing, as a tabloidization. The problem, I think, is that, relative to say 20 years ago, you still had that discipline in the broad press, right? So that is now gone. I think the SEO captured everybody. So everybody now tries to be more clicky and more sensational and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, it's homogenized the different approaches. Like, you might have had different publications taking different approaches, but now also with the internet, one of the things that one might have subscribed to the Financial Times in years gone by is the access to expertise. But now, like, experts can go and just monetize their own, build a following and then monetize that as well.
And that is in itself, like, that's an interesting tension in the industry, because journalists are supposed to be truth speakers and free to say what they want and, fight for whatever, but they're contractually obliged to work for their publications. And so you end up with this tension in terms of how do you serve your publication, but also say what you want when you want. And you'll find that junior reporters often sort of disappear, like, apart from like retweeting their officially published stories, unless you already had a legacy following and you've been kind of okayed as a sort of safe bet internally, you can get reprimanded for your tweets, right? Because it's not in line with company policy. And I think that is very problematic for a journalist, because journalists are supposed to be just asking questions all the time. But but they're not prepared to tolerate journalists when they fall out of line with their own institutional kind of objectives, which I am slightly sympathetic about, because if you are a journalist, you will have certain values. we all have
everyone
biases.
Does. Yeah, everyone does.
But I might also decide, even though I am, say I'm culturally or politically right-wing, but my first job is at The Guardian, right? I might be inclined 20 years ago, I would have just bit my lip and done the work, and nobody would have known anything about my personal politics. It would have been completely segmented. But these days, you have this kind of journalistic activism that arrives, where you are working for a publication that has a very clearly sort of specified political leaning, but you feel there's this sort of attitude that you can lobby for your own personal view within the organized. And that's where there's a discrepancy, because suddenly I can understand why, if you're the Telegraph or the Guardian and you've hired all these journalists, and then they're writing one thing on your papers, but then they're saying the exact opposite or saying politically charged things that go against your, what your audience is actually paying for. That's a problem. I can see that's a problem. So
really, okay?
Well, I just think it's a tension.
Yeah, I mean, I can understand why a corporate would feel like they were entitled to police the views of their employees in their private space, despite it being public. I can understand why they might feel entitled to that. Personally, I would be quite okay with that. If Charles started posting about things that, for example, in the Bitcoin space that I was not in agreement with, I would say, that's his point of view. What's your problem?
That's good from your perspective. But I think most publications would be worried that his views would be seen as representing your views.
Yeah.
And so that's where the problem arrives. And then there is usually internal kind of behind the scenes struggles and negotiations about, well, you wrote this on Twitter. It goes against our guidelines. Can you take it down?
Yeah.
And that's problematic because no, like you say, like no journalistic organization should be telling its journalists to take tweets down. But at the same time, if you're at the BBC and, the BBC has a very clear cut, commitment to neutrality, where you can't tolerate journalists going around being highly political.
But we see that constantly
time.
with Gary Lineker. I think there have been many instances, many attempts at cancelling him, for example, because of course he's a football pundit, but he expresses strongly political views.
It's very difficult.
And people are like, well, why does he get to do that? And I can't remember what the specific policy was that allowed him to do that.
I don't think I don't think he was. I think it was all. I think he got in quite a lot of trouble for it, didn't he?
No, he got in trouble in terms of the public controversy, but the BBC never took action. And I think he the Rest Is podcast network. He owns that now.
Oh,
right?
does he?
Yeah,
no,
it's
I don't.
wildly successful.
Yeah, I know the podcast is successful. I didn't realize he was the owner of it.
Well, but I'm not sure if you know, but it's not just one podcast either. It's
a series.
No, it's like the rest is football, the rest is politics, the rest is, and it's like a whole network of topics. And, if you can get a podcast to scale, which we're not at scale yet, but if you can, they're wildly, wildly profitable.
I'm sure they are. So he's loaded from it.
Well, yeah. Well, enough to leave the BBC, and he was there for decades, wasn't he?
But you see, maybe that was kind of still the system working because like everyone saw, the BBC has this duty to be impartial. Gary Lineker abused it, and whether or not the organization took action or not, he had enough like negative feedback to make it not worth his while to stay and do his own thing. And now he's free to say whatever he wants, right? So that's kind of that sort of adaptive free market system, which I like. But I look, it's journalists can't be priests. You can't the partiality thing is really difficult because you're asking journalists to basically have no public opinions and, give up on a public profile that expresses anything or, shows any sorts of loyalties whatsoever. And most people these days, find me some youngsters who haven't got some sort of internet history that shows one leaning or the other because maybe 20 years ago you could find these people, but these days most people have original sin in terms of expressing things by the time they come to the workplace. So
honestly, you hope that they do because it just means that they've lived a fairly normal youth.
Yeah. And it's just that there's no forgiveness. We all make mistakes as young kids.
Yeah.
In the old days, going back to the privacy point, in the old days, you made a mistake. And worst case scenario, you dropped that friend group and you started off somewhere else and nobody knew what you'd done, it was fine. You could completely reinvent yourself.
Yeah.
Now, not so easy, right? Because your online history goes with you wherever you go.
I think young people are getting better at internet hygiene as well. They will start and scrap accounts like it's nothing. I've still got the same Hotmail that I started in uni, right? Which is absurd, right? Why am I doing that? That's just the dumbest thing ever.
Yeah.
I wanted to, I want to be respectful of your time.
No.
I could easily talk to you for another 3 hours.
No, nobody needs to hear me for another 3 hours. Seriously.
No, I've found it fascinating, actually. You wrote 2 bullet points. Western elites repress uncomfortable truths narcissistically, unlike China's guarded elite truth access. Real talk migrated to private events. Public FT output is now performative and detached from the ground truth.
I think that's true. I think you end up now, there's a market for sort of events, right? Because that's the only place where people can actually say stuff without the kind of scrutiny of the public immediate, just the public arena. Mm-hmm. And that is not necessarily a good thing because that just encourages more more of a kind of, well, that's the sort of Epsteinian world, right? You end up with these private groups, parties, whatever, elites, networks, and they're saying one thing behind the scenes and not, just because it's safe. It's not fit for public consumption. And that in a weird way is incredibly non-democratic and crappy. So I think the only cure for that is, as a society, we need to grow up a little bit and become more forgiving of people when they say stupid stuff online. Because at the moment, and I think this is in the political space very much the case. So, I wouldn't want to be a politician these days. I think it's probably the most horrible job in the world, where you are. Yes, it comes with a lot of power, but to be continuously, scrutinized to that degree, and any mistake you make. In this 3-hour podcast, I've probably said all sorts of stupid things, and I've made up stuff because that's what I haven't. I tried not to. I try to be upfront when I don't know stuff, but at the same time, we're all human and we can make mistakes, or we can misspeak, or we, and at the moment, there's just no tolerance for that. And if the press scrutinized my dialogue to the same degree as any of the politicians that we like to kind of make a mockery of, I would be just as ridiculed, because we all make mistakes. And sometimes I think if we were just a little bit more forgiving, then it would be easier to have a sort of adult conversation about things in public.
I think what you were alluding to, at least it signaled to me in my experience, was something a little deeper than saying stupid things. I think there are truths that are apparent to everybody in the corridors of power, and some of them, the skilled among them, have an intuition of what is and isn't permissible to speak out loud for public consumption. And I think that has filtered into the media. And we started this conversation where I recited one of your posts, recounting this sort of malaise that's gone on in society in Western nations. We live in the UK, but it applies equally, I think, to Europe and the United States, where there's a situation where there's a gradual decline, and yet it seems to be we are unable as a society to arrest that decline, even though I think there are clear policy actions that can be taken. And I suspect that you're hitting the heart of the problem, which is why I wanted to invite you in for this chat to begin with, is that if we can't speak freely and identify the truth, or at least have conversations around what we believe is truthful, this is just going to continue until we hit rock bottom, and we're far from that right now.
Yeah, I'm reminded of sort of how we all process uncomfortable truths about ourselves. Sometimes it's really painful to acknowledge that you're not perfect and you've done something stupid or said something you shouldn't have said, and then to take it back. And I think as a society, that is what we're avoiding. We're avoiding that sort of introspection, which would allow us to go, hang on a minute, maybe we were a little bit wrong about this. And this goes back to COVID. I don't think we've still had a reckoning over how we behaved. And I think we're at this point where we're suppressing the memory of COVID, and most people just don't want to take, the people who went really authoritarian and wanted to kind of allow, toddlers to get run over the street, run over in a street just because, literally that happened to me. I was walking with my daughter and she ran into the street, and these two elderly people would rather have her go into the street and get run over by a car than help and stop her because of the fear of getting infected of COVID, which was just, to me, absolutely extraordinary reaction, right? So we still haven't had a reckoning over how we behaved, because as a society, it would make us it would force us to realize that maybe we behaved quite badly. So I agree with you, and I think you're also right on this other aspect that some things are just, we can't say them out loud because, there is a fear that, I don't know what it is actually. What is the fear? The fear is that society won't be able to take it. Like, we're too sensitive to take this, rough, like this medicine that we need to take. So we say that,
and I promise you this is the last one.
Fine.
But because we touched upon that, something just came to mind that, we had planned to have it as a last point of discussion, but I wasn't expecting it to be 3 hours into a discussion. UK local elections, absolutely groundbreaking. It's a groundswell of support for a brand new party called Reform. And they have predominantly been on the back of campaigning against immigrants, immigration, mass immigration, and even more than that, to remigrate people, basically kick them out. Or was that Restore that brought that policy?
I think that's Restore.
Restore is kind of like an offshoot of Reform,
yeah,
right?
They're more extreme, I think.
Yeah, okay.
I don't know. I'm not, don't quote me on that.
I wasn't aware of the extent of migration to this country in the last 5 years until I looked at a chart. Because my experience in this country has been, I came in and the first 3 years, economically speaking, were incredible. And then we had the financial crisis. And it's never really recovered from that. And the job market is really soft. Wages have been stagnant and probably in real terms have declined. And yet in 2 years ago, we had a spike in immigration that was 4 or 5 times the 10-year average. And I'm looking at that and thinking, for what? Now, I am an immigrant. Let me make it clear. I'm the son of immigrants in Australia. I was born in Melbourne. So I was born in Melbourne to immigrant parents. And then I immigrated here and I'm a naturalized citizen here. So I'm in favor of immigration where there is a purpose and a demand from the host country that's going to absorb them. So when I look at a number like that, a 4 or 5x increase over the 10-year average, the question in my mind, and then I have a look at the job market, and it's like, why did that happen? Where was the demand for such a spike in immigration coming from? Who made that policy decision? And I don't see any answers. And not only that, I think anyone questioning that, and maybe it was the manner in which they questioned it, they were shouted down as being racist. I don't think, any government policy should be off limits for discussion. And then we have a party like Reform emerge and make that as a pretty much their only policy. I mean, I've seen some vox pops on the streets going around asking their supporters, they're like, name one other policy, and they just can't do it, right? Because that's been the messaging from the party to incredible success. And you could even argue Brexit, that was a key plank of Brexit as well. Other people argue sovereignty. I'd say, look at the billboards. It
was borders. Yeah, I know, definitely.
It was borders, it was immigrants, it was brown people, basically, right? So where is that all coming from? But equally, if we had been able to talk about these topics in a mature, accurate, truthful way, would that have uncovered something perhaps people don't want to address?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, so what your hypothesis is that if we had allowed, if the Overton window had allowed for this sort of discussion earlier on, then we would have had policy that perhaps might have jarred with some of the way that we see ourselves.
No, not necessarily. I think not necessarily. I think the elites probably thought that. But first of all, I can't pinpoint where the policy that led to a spike in immigration in the last 2 or 3 years. It was one particular year. I don't know where that comes from.
I think a lot of that was to do with the Ukraine war. So I think there was a large spike in immigration to do with Ukrainian immigration, which was relatively temporary. Like some of that immigration, I think, has reversed. And there may have been some other, I think Afghanistan and and Syria. So a lot of these immigration spikes are often connected to instability in specific regions, often to do with like foreign policy that we ourselves are kind of responsible for, right? So there's a sense of duty, I guess, to take those migrants from a refugee perspective, right? But I think there's also a lot of, I think the refugee thing is still, I mean, I haven't got the figures to hand, but my understanding is that the refugee element is still a very small proportion of the kind of economic migration, which is much higher. And I think that is the bit that you could have had a reasonable conversation about, because I think a lot of that is to do with welfare and stability, and the fact that there is a perception that if you can come to the UK or to any Western country, you will get certain benefits that you won't get in your own country, right? And that opens the door to a very uncomfortable conversation about sovereignty in other countries and whether or not, do we as Westerners have a duty then to help those countries create the wealth they're coming here because they obviously have instability there. Do we have some sort of duty to help them stabilize their own economies? Now, that's very difficult without becoming imperialistic. And I think that is, and it's our kind of general, I think our general knee-jerk reaction and to do with the fact that we are a former empire that constrains us on that front, because we don't want to be seen being overtly imperial, right? And yet it's very difficult to talk about, well, where are the failings in terms of the governance of these countries themselves? Why is it that they can't create the prosperity? Is it the case that Western countries are just continuously extracting the resources? Is there some sort of fundamental failing? But then, this is also why we give so much foreign aid. And, so Western countries do give a lot of foreign aid to try and help stabilize some of these countries and rebates, etc. So, I mean, it's a very complicated scenario, but I think it fundamentally is connected to the kind of the vacuum in some cases that was left in terms of I mean, this goes way back, but I think when a lot of these empirical systems pulled out, there was a governance sort of deficit, a responsible governance deficit. And it wasn't the fault of any people. It was just, like me, when I became an entrepreneur, I just didn't know what I was doing. This is just natural situation. You suddenly get responsibility, accountability, and you become a manager of a large organization, but you have no experience. It's a tough situation, right? You need advisors, but you might not want to if you're like me, and I think I can do it better. Like everything the FT was telling me was like rubbish. I know, and turns out actually there were maybe some elements of that old system that I should have imported into my own system. So I think it's like that. I don't think it's necessarily, that empire is bad. And, we're all part of an empire in some shape or form. I mean, the EU is just as much of an empire. The US is becoming an empire. The China, BRI, it's an empire. We're stuck between empires. We've always been stuck. But what is an empire really? It's just a economic efficiency system. It's a system where certain satellites subsidize different elements of. It's a cross subsidization system. Any empire. It's just that often
that's a very generous description.
You have different ones, right? So the EU would see it as a benign empire, where cross subsidization generally is in the interests of mutual growth and cohesive outcomes, right? A less benign one would be one where this cross subsidization is basically channeled towards rewarding one particular
jurisdiction
country,
or function.
Exactly.
Most of them have been extractive of their satellites. Let's just say,
yes.
Okay, I think that's a good place to end it. And I've probably exhausted you. We've gone for just over 3 hours. Izabella, can you tell people where they can find you your startups, your Twitter handles, your socials, anything?
So I'm on X at Kaminska, Izakaminska. I'm also on Blue Sky, but I don't operate very often there. I'm on thepeg.co for my stablecoin stuff, and for the kind of everything else, it's the blind spot, which is the-blindspot.com. And the dash is annoying, but the blind spot was taken by a blind company that makes blinds, so I had to have the dash.
Izabella Kaminska, thank you so much for coming and joining us.
Thank you for having me.